In this video, we're going to talk about different types of muscle fibers. So with that, we've got this single outcome. Okay, I want you to know that on this, they're classified in three ways. We've got type 1, type 2A, type 2B, or 2X. Usually they're 2X. I describe them as 2X. For those of you that go on further, especially those of you in exercise science, it is possible they let you know that there are actually like 7 or 8 or even 9, I don't remember what the number is, but there are multiple types, there are even more types of muscle fibers, okay? I want to acknowledge that, but again, to keep it simple, and because the differences are so subtle, we're going to focus on 3, and really a lot of what we talk about, we're just going to focus on type 1 versus type 2X. So to start off, we need to understand what a motor unit is. And so a motor unit is composed of a single motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it innervates. Okay? And notice that on this picture here, this is supposed to represent a single muscle. Well, there are 3 different motor units, okay? And so in order for all of those muscle fibers to be activated in a single muscle, it takes multiple neurons. Okay, so there isn't like one neuron that just causes your bicep to contract. There are many neurons that are involved that cause it to contract. And so some of your fibers might be contracting, some of them might not be. Okay, but one motor neuron innervates multiple muscle fibers. As far as I understand it, a muscle fiber, a single muscle fiber is only innervated by one motor neuron. Okay, so it's not getting signals from multiple neurons. And so that's what I said there. When it comes to motor units, and this is similar to an action potential, we have what's called the all or nothing principle. So when a motor neuron or a motor unit reaches threshold, an action potential in that neuron will occur. This will stimulate the muscle fibers, and the muscle fibers will ultimately have an action potential. And then this is the key point here. Those muscle fibers, when they have an action potential, will contract and they will generate maximal force. Now, there are things that can be done that we'll talk about in a different video that actually determine what maximum force is. And so that maximum force, there's a caveat to it. It kind of depends on what's going on with that muscle cell, okay? It depends on the angle, how stretched out it is, and a bunch of other things, okay? But no matter what, regardless of the situation that it's in, those muscle fibers are going to contract maximally. So this leads us into these 3 primary types of muscle fibers. Okay, so we've got slow twitch fibers, which are referred to as type 1. They rely on oxidative metabolism. We've talked about oxidative metabolism at the beginning of the semester, so that just means using oxygen to create ATP. As a result, they have a lot of mitochondria, a lot of capillaries, a lot of myoglobin. Okay? Mitochondria use the oxygen, capillaries get the oxygen into the cell, myoglobin gets that oxygen from wherever it's at in the cell to the mitochondria. When it comes to the number of the neurons and motor units, they have small neurons that are stimulated first. Okay, so it requires just a really small stimulus for them to reach threshold, but they only innervate a couple of fibers, okay? On the myosin head of these slow twitch fibers, the myosin the ATPase, it's myosin ATPase, so that's an enzyme that breaks down ATP, is relatively slow. And so it takes longer to go through that full cross-bridge cycle, so they don't pull the rope quite as fast. Then we've got intermediate fibers, and I didn't have a word cloud for this. Okay, so intermediate fibers, they rely on oxidative metabolism to some extent, so they have kind of an intermediate amount of mitochondria, capillaries, and myoglobin. Everything's just kind of in the middle, right? So they're stimulated after type 1, but before type 2X. And so they have more motor units, more muscle fibers per neuron, but not as many as type 2X. And so they've kind of got this intermediate speed myosin ATPase enzyme. And then we've got fast twitch fibers, okay? They rely mostly on glycolysis or glycolytic metabolism, okay? They don't rely very much on oxidative metabolism because it doesn't matter. They don't have very many mitochondria, capillaries, or myoglobin, so we could pump them full of oxygen, but they're not going to produce a lot of energy because they don't have very many mitochondria, capillaries, or myoglobin. However, the neurons that innervate these fibers are very large. but they have a high threshold or a more positive threshold. So it takes a bigger stimulus for them to be activated. These motor units also have lots of muscle fibers. So one neuron will innervate many, many, many muscle fibers. Okay, and they have the fastest ATPase enzyme, so they go through the cross-bridge cycling the quickest. Okay, so they can do their job. But because they rely less on oxidative metabolism, they get tired very quickly. What determines how fast cross-bridge cycling occurs? Well, in the previous slides, I've already answered that. It's the specific type of myosin ATPase that's found on myosin. Okay, remember, ATPase is an enzyme that breaks down ATP. We call it myosin ATPase because it's on myosin. Okay, and really this goes hand in hand. The speed at which it converts ATP into both ADP and phosphate, and then ultimately allows ADP and phosphate to be released. Type 1 fibers is relatively slow. Type 2X fibers, it's really fast. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to look at this diagram and I want you to play spot the difference. Okay, there are 4 primary differences between fast twitch, so think of the top as type 2X, and slow twitch, so think of the bottom as type 1. And I want you to see what specific characteristics you can identify that are different between the two. Okay, so the first thing is this x-axis on this graph here. So how much force can they produce? Okay, fast twitch fibers produce a relatively large amount of force compared to slow twitch. Okay, next we've got how fast they fatigue. Fast twitch, even though they produce a lot of force, fatigue really quickly. Okay, notice that they can only last for 2 or 3 minutes. This is why the 800-meter distance and track is the worst. Okay, fun to watch, the worst to compete in. Okay, next we've got the number of fibers innervated by a single neuron. Okay, so in this case we've got, I think, 6 fibers innervated by one neuron as opposed to the slow twitch where we've only got 2 fibers. And then the last thing is the duration of the twitch. Fast twitch muscle fibers can go through a contraction relaxation process really quickly as opposed to a slow twitch fiber. So here is a table that kind of gives you just basic general idea of the differences between type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. I'm not going to go through each of the characteristics. You can look at this and read it. But notice that really type 2A is kind of a combination of type 1 and type 2X. And so at the end of this video, can you do these 3 things? Can you provide characteristics of type 1, type 2A, and type 2X muscle fibers?